At the closing ceremony, the 30th annual MLK Parade in Denver on Monday, members of Black Lives Matter 5280 took to the stage, uninvited, and addressed many issues, including the Michael Marshall investigation. On Thursday, Denver District Attorney Mitch Morrissey announced that charges would not be filed in the Marshall case against the deputies involved, which was followed by the release of the video of the incident. Patty, we've seen bits and pieces of the video. I mean, we're going to see more of it released today, but we've seen already some of it. Were you surprised by Morrissey's announcement?
No, because it's pretty much in line with what Morrissey has continued to announce. It's not like we've had any law enforcement officers in Denver charged in connection with the death of prisoners. In this case, it also wasn't a big surprise that the city waited. They were a little speedier than they've been on Marvin Booker and some other situations. The Marvin Booker video wasn't released for 9 months, and that's a fairly similar situation except for the speed. But you could see why they didn't want to do it before MLK Day, because people were going to protest. What the city should have known and didn't realize is that there were going to be protests anyway. And I thought it was fascinating to see what those Black Lives Matter 5280 activists did and said that day, because it showed that what a generational split there is. And not just a generational split, but a class split, because you've got a mayor of Denver who's black, the second black mayor in Denver. You have this longtime leaders of the parade who are civil rights activists who were on the front lines in the 60s, and now you have people coming up and challenging them. And if you listen to a lot of the discussion, fascinating issues. People are very distrustful of whoever's in power, no matter what their color is. And we have video of the arguments. And ultimately, the people who had to speak, who were planning to speak, had a lot of trouble speaking over the Black Lives Matter people. But then afterwards, they made a pretty good case for themselves.
Todd, we're seeing that was a pretty big deal. The closing ceremony of the parade's not broadcast on television, but the fact that you would have activists take over a closing ceremony of that kind of extent's a big deal. At what point does this become a major issue for Mayor Hancock? So far, he's been able to survive the kind of being at least a little under the radar of the general population.
Well, I think it's already been a major issue for him when you consider the struggle he had, given that one vandalism time where the marchers go down to the fallen officer memorial, and he ordered those police officers to stand down and basically allowed that vandalism to happen. So that cost him morale with the police inside his department. Now he's got a morale problem with young people who, quite frankly, ought to be a new base to his political power. So it's definitely a problem for Mayor Hancock. I would say that, because I want to bring this up again with some other topics that we'll be talking about tonight, Patty talks about the speed with which the video was released. Of course, kudos to the Colorado Independent for filing that lawsuit, because what we're really starting to see is, look, I think open records is a zero-sum game. You're either winning or you're losing. And most of the time now, we're only winning when it's by lawsuit.
Eric, this is one in a long line of items that are probably going to impact the DA election this November. And I think folks knew about the pretty high-profile civic elections last year, but the Denver District Attorney goes for election this November. Or do you think this is going to spur some surprising announcements from those candidates?
I think it's going to put more pressure on those candidates to be very clear. They're not going to be able to dodge. They're not going to be able to weave. They're not going to try to have it both ways and consolidate law and order, tough on crime, police support with support from the left and from Black Lives Matters and other groups such as that. I mean, one correction, the DA election really isn't in November. For all practical purposes,
that's a very good point.
The district attorney's election is this summer. I'm not aware of a Republican candidate running. It's a Democratic city. The Democratic primary will determine who Mitch Morrisey's successor is.
Excellent correction. You're absolutely right.
I've not seen the video, but I've read a blow-by-blow, excuse the bad pun, description of it, and you have to say it is disturbing. The bottom line question to me is twofold. Did the police officers kill this individual, Michael Marshall? But it's even bigger than that. Would any of this have unfolded if he had not been in police custody? I mean, even if there was not direct evidence of intent and a specific blow, this whole thing, it strikes me like the situation in Staten Island, New York with Eric Garner, which is, in that case, the guy was selling black market cigarettes and pays for it with his life. In this case, you have somebody who is paranoid, schizophrenic. He's in jail awaiting $100 a bond. That was his bail, was $100, and yet all this unfolds. Patty's right. I mean, Mitch Morrissey, that is his pattern. He does not indict police officers. He hasn't. He has another year in office. He won't. I mean, I think that's a fairly safe wager to make that that is not his MO. Somehow, as a city, and bigger than that, as a country, we have to figure out a way to come to grips with this. The pattern, you can always excuse the individual situation. You can always, or almost always say there's not substantial evidence to convict. But yet there's a pattern of way too many black and brown and other individuals paying for such conduct with their lives. So you got to solve the problem. And then at some point you have to renew confidence in the police departments around the country, because the real people who are paying this price are the residents of inner city, not just in Denver, but in Baltimore and Philadelphia and other places where police officers are rightly taking a hands-off approach, or if not rightly, at least understandably taking a hands-off approach, and the victims of crime are also minorities.
Ben, I think some, whether it be activists or I think just normal citizens, are asking, if you see so many of these cases and none of them have charges filed, people are asking, what is it going to take to see charges filed? And I understand the DA's point of wanting to take a case that he or she thinks they can win, but if they're always deciding that if they win or can't win that, they become the jury of one. And even if they're going to lose the case, wouldn't it be better to at least have a jury of 12 deciding if it can be won or lost? Does a DA need to take a stand to let a jury to decide sometimes if a case can be won or lost and not just make that consideration themselves?
Well, I think that, as Eric alluded to, there's a very clear pattern in Denver where we've see pretty horrible treatment of people in the jail system, and then basically no repercussion for police officers, including having these committees and panels reinstate officers that have a history of violence or demonstrated histories. So, I think there's no question that the pattern needs to change. I would be very interested in seeing this metric that the DA's office uses. You can look at the Morrisseys case and say, why on earth are they continuing to hold those charges when it's very clear that he's innocent and was in jail for 25 years for nothing? So, to me, I think what you're seeing is that the mayor increasingly has no constituency. And this is not a generational divide. There was a great piece in the Colorado Independent that talked about the Black Ministerial Alliance in a meeting with the mayor where there was huge tension. And these are not young people. These aren't the 20-somethings and the millennials sitting there. These are the civil rights leaders from the past sitting in meetings with the mayor that have become very contentious. So I think there's no question that there is a broad distrust of the power and authority system in the city of Denver, particularly amongst minority communities and people who are in distressed situations. And I think that the total lack of transparency from both the mayor's office and the district attorney's office is not just lamentable, but frankly, it's cowardice in my view. And I think that they're hiding behind policy. And I think that they're frankly taking advantage of the fact that we don't have a very robust media in the city anymore. The Denver Post certainly is unwilling to criticize the administration. And in fact, where the Colorado Independent identified a couple of thousand Black Lives Matter protesters, the Post didn't really make a mention of how many there were, which I found to be a really disappointing editorial just in excluding information. So there's a huge problem. There's hopefully some increasing accountability coming with this election, but I fear that frankly we're not going to get it, and I think until we see a change in leadership that we're not going to see any change in our systems.